The Puppets of Pandemonium, Sleaze and Sloth in the Media Elite by Howard Bloom. From You Are Being Lied To, edited by Russ Kidd. Everything you've ever heard about PAC journalism is true. In fact, it's an understatement. Though journalists pride themselves on their intellectual independence, they are neither very intellectual nor even marginally independent. They are animals. In fact, they operate on the same herd instincts that guide ants, hoofed mammals, and numerous other social creatures. In 1827, well before the sciences of ethology and sociobiology had even been invented, historian and essayist Thomas Carlyle said that the critics of his day were like sheep. Put a stick in the path as a lead sheep goes by, wrote the sage, and the beast will jump over it. Remove the stick, and each following sheep in line will jump at precisely the same spot, even though there's no longer anything to jump over. Things haven't changed much since then. If the key critics at the New York Times, the Village Voice, and the Rolling Stone fall in love with the musical artist, every other critic in the country will follow their lead. On the other hand, if these lead sheep say that an artist is worthless, every other woolly-minded critic from Portland to Peoria will miraculously draw the same conclusion. When I was out on tour with ZZ Top in 1976, I remember sitting at one of the group's concerts between the critics from Minneapolis, from Minneapolis's two major dallies. At the same time, I was also handling a group called Dr. Buzzard's Original Savannah Band. The lead sheep in the press hated ZZ Top, but they loved Dr. Buzzard. So it had been fairly easy to land major features lauding the Original Savannah Band in the New York Times and the Village Voice during the same week. As I sat between Minneapolis's two finest models of journalistic integrity and independent judgment in the moments before the lights dimmed and ZZ Top hit the stage, one was reading the New York Times article on Dr. Buzzard and the other was reading the Voices, snorting up the latest hints on how they should feel about the music of the month. Not surprisingly, when the concert ended and the duo returned to their typewriters, they cranked out copy with identical judgments. ZZ Top, whose music the Village Voice in a blaring headline had once said sounded like hammered shit, was roundly panned, despite the fact that both critics admitted grudgingly in print that via some collective descent into tastelessness. Let me read that part again. ZZ Top, whose music the Village Voice in a blaring headline had once said sounded like hammered shit, was roundly panned, despite the fact that both critics admitted grudgingly in print that via some collective descent into tastelessness. Okay. The crowd had gone wild. Then both turned their attention to slaveringly syncophantic paeans to Dr. Buzzard, thus echoing the opinions they'd absorbed from their fashionable reading earlier in the evening. If I sounded like I despise such attitude, it's because I do. An appealing number of the acts the press and the publicists who fawn over journalistic dictates dislikes have tremendous validity. I always felt it was my job to do for erring writers what Edmund Wilson, the literary critic, had done for me. When I was a teenager, I couldn't make head nor tails of T.S. Eliot. His poetry utterly baffled me. So I came to the conclusion that Eliot's work was an elaborate hoax, a pastiche of devices designed to fool the pretentious into thinking that if they admitted a failure to understand all of his erudite references, they make themselves look like fools. Then along came Edmund Wilson, or at least one of his books, and gave me the perceptual key that unlocked Eliot's poetry. Now that I finally understand the stuff, I fell in love with it. What's more, I started giving public readings of Eliot's work. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock became one of the biggest influences on my 16-year-old life. My task as a publicist was to provide similar perceptual keys. It was to read every lyric an artist had ever written, listen to his or her album 20 or 30 times, and immerse myself in his work until I understood its merit. Then my job was to impart that understanding to a hostile press. In other words, my fellow publicists liked writing waves. I preferred the more difficult task of making them happen. Once more, I felt my job was to act as a surrogate journalist. I studied everything that had ever been written, quite literally, about a new client in English, or sometimes French, my only other tongue. Then subjected the artist to an interview that lasted anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days. My goal was to find the interesting stories, the things that would amaze, the facts that would make sense out of the music, the angles that would make for unrejectable feature stories, and the tales that would give some insight into the hidden emotional and biographical sources of the performer's creations. After one of these interviews, John Cougar Mellencamp, a natural-born talker, was literally so exhausted that he couldn't croak more than a sentence or two to his wife, and then fell asleep in his living room chair. We'd been going since 10 in the morning, and it was now 4 in the afternoon. At any rate, this may explain why it was not Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah Band, the group with the automatic popularity that I spent 6 years working on, but ZZ Top, the band the press either refused to write about altogether or put down in some variation of Robert, Village Voice, Christgau's hammered shit verdict. It took 3 years to turn the press around. Creating that about face involved a process I used to call perceptual engineering. ZZ Top had authentically and had authenticity and validity out the kazoo. My task was to do everything in my power to reverse the direction of the herd's stampede and to make the critics see the substance that they had overlooked. For the first few years, the press continued to sneer whenever the group's name came up. But gradually, I got a few lead sheep by the horns. Do sheep have horns? And turned them around. The rest of the herd followed. One result. For the next 10 years, ZZ Top became one of the few bands of its genre to command genuine, unadulterated press respect. Eventually, the group didn't need me anymore. They don't to this day. The press is now ZZ Top's best publicist. Say something nasty at a press party about this band, and those in the know will turn around and snarl, forgetting that over a decade ago they would have growled if you'd even confessed to listening to one of the Texas band LPs. Public relations taught me a good deal more about why facts were not, after all, what a good reporter wanted. He wanted a story that would either titillate his audience, fit his own clique's political prejudices, or replicate a piece of reportage he'd read somewhere else. If you really want to have your blood curdled, ask for the tale of the day that two members of the paparazzi, using a fast car, chased Michael Jackson's van down a crowded highway, jumped a divider, raced at 60 miles an hour against traffic on a two-way highway, thus endangering lives, then jumped the divider again and spun at a 90-degree angle, blocking the highway, nearly causing Jackson's van to crash. The photographers exited their vehicles, cameras in hand, smugly thinking they cornered Jackson and would get a highly prized photo. They did not show any identification and could easily have been nut jobs attempting to pull what was threatened in a large pile of Daily Mail Jackson received: an assassination. Hence, Jackson's security guards, LAPD officers on leave, exited the van, which had been forced to a screeching halt in mid-highway. Not knowing what they were up against, one of the guards armed himself with a truck iron. Seeing this weapon, one of the photographers, this is not a joke or exaggeration, pulled a gun. Then the two hightailed it to a telephone, called their editor at the New York Daily News, and reported that they'd been threatened for no reason by Michael Jackson's bodyguards. The editor then prepared a front-page headline story about the violent way in which Michael Jackson's toughs had manhandled innocent press folk. It was on its way to press. I did some quick research, not easy on a Sunday afternoon. Found out that the photographer who had waved his firearm had been arrested on 2 felony charges for similar behavior, got on the phone, pried the paper's publisher from a golf game, and gave him the real details of the story. It took 2 hours of threatening the man with the nasty facts to convince the publisher to yank the story. On normal occasions, there is no one to stop a falsified tale of this nature from hitting the headline of a publication thirsting for tabloid blood. TMZ. I suspect a similar race to avoid a pack of rabid paparazzi was in full sprint the night Princess Di was killed in a car crash. Excuse me. That these principles of press misconduct are regularly applied in the world of pop music doesn't really matter much. It will have hardly any effect on the fate of the world. But the same principles at work in the field of politics have wreaked havoc. In fact, they have made the media one of the most egregious collaborators in mass murder throughout the 20th century. While millions were being killed in the Soviet Union, Western journalists participated in the cover-up. Walter Duran of the New York Times, who was supplied by the people's government with a luxurious apartment in Moscow and a good supply of caviar, said nothing about Stalin's murderous rampage. Reporting the truth might have endangered his cozy relationship with the Soviet authorities. Hundreds of other journalists visited the Soviet Union without reporting on the slaughter. Lincoln Steffens, an influential American newspaperman, said, "I have seen the future and it works." This didn't fit the facts, but it did fit Steffens' political perceptions. Writers with similarly idealistic beliefs tried to give the impression that while the West was decomposing, the Soviet Union was showing the way to a brave new world. More than mere idealism was involved. Writers were determined to remain politically fashionable. My bad. They didn't want to be snubbed by their peers. After all, the bright lights of high culture were pro-Soviet. George Bernard Shaw had gone to the Soviet Union and had said it was ushering in 1,000 bright tomorrows. He'd read his own dreams into his land of horror. He'd read his own dreams into this land of horror. Critic Edmund Wilson had said the death chamber of the Soviet state was a moral sanctuary where the light never stops shining. Writers who attempted to tell the truth were viciously attacked as enemies of progressive humanitarianism. That sounds familiar. Meanwhile, shielded by a dishonest Western press, Soviet authorities killed over 25 million men, women, and children, shooting, starving, torturing, or working them to death. Now the press is doing it again. This time in its coverage of Israel and the Arab states. Several years ago, when the offices of Omni magazine were picketed by Arabs for 4 days because of an article I'd written, I was forced to dive into Jewish issues. I discovered, to my horror, that vast areas of fact were being violently distorted by the media in a subtly anti-Semitic manner, and that no one was getting the truth out. Take the following instance. In the early 1970s, the Palestine Liberation Organization had created so much havoc in Lebanon that Jordan's non-Palestinian Hashemite government decided to throw the PLO out. The PLO moved its operations to southern Lebanon, where the Islamic population welcomed the organization's members as brothers, but the PLO were not in a brotherly mood. They turned their visit into a military occupation, confiscating Lebanese homes and autos, raping Lebanese girls, and lining up groups of Lebanese who didn't acquiesce quickly enough, then machine gunning them to death. The PLO was even harsher to Lebanon's 2,000-year-old Christian population. Using Soviet-supplied heavy artillery, the PLO virtually leveled 2 Christian cities, Sidon and Tyre, and carried out massacres in smaller Christian villages. Only 1 page on the Lebanese atrocities appeared in the New York Times during a 4-year period. No articles whatsoever showed up in the Times of London. Why didn't the press cover any of this? You can infer some of the reasons from the comments on press behavior I mentioned above. For one thing, there's the slavish herd impulse which drives the press. Or is that slavish? See Evelyn Waugh's brilliant novel Scoop for a satirical view of the press at work as Waugh saw it when he was covering the news in Ethiopia. It had become chic among media types to run away from Israel and into the arms of the Arabs. For another, there's the unerring tendency of the press to make the cause of mass murderers politically fashionable. And finally, there's the fact that the PLO had done its best to make sure it got every story covered its own way. Yasser Arafat's kindly organization killed 6 Western journalists who strayed from the PLO line. Yasser's boys took an uncooperative Lebanese newspaper publisher captive, dismembered him 1 joint at a time, and sent a piece of the corpse to each of the Beirut Foreign Press Corps with a photo of the man being tortured alive. The message was self-explanatory. The Associated Press, AP, United Press International, UPI, and the major American newspapers had long been frantic to maintain a foothold in Beirut. After all, Syria, Iraq, and most of the other Arab countries wouldn't let their correspondents in. Beirut was their only toehold in the Arab world, so each outlet bargained sycophantically with the PLO. They promised not to publish stories on PLO atrocities, including the military seizures of southern Lebanon. The major news organizations submitted credentials on all journalists sent to the area for PLO approval. They agreed to headquarter their reporters in a PLO-controlled hotel, and they let the PLO assign a guide, that is, a censor, watchdog, and feeder of misinformation to each writer. Within a short amount of time, only PLO sympathizers were covering Middle Eastern news. In the early 1980s, Israel sent forces into Lebanon. Every 24 hours or so, the PLO threw a conference at which it rolled out its version of the day's events. The press dutifully printed what it had been given. PLO spokesmen handed out photos of Israeli tanks rolling through the two Christian cities the PLO had leveled several years earlier, with captions explaining that the PLO caused damage clearly visible in the pictures had been inflicted by the Israelis. Wow. The press printed these distortions as fact. The PLO distributed photos of a Beirut infant wrapped in bandages with a caption declaring that the baby had been burned over 75% of his body by Israelis. Most major newspapers ran the story on page 1. President Reagan was so moved that he kept the picture on his desk for days. Later, UPI was forced to issue a retraction. It turned out that the PLO press release accompanying the photos had contained several minor inaccuracies. The child had been injured not by an Israeli shell, but by a PLO rocket. And 75% of the baby's body had not been burned. The infant had suffered a sprained ankle. The PLO had been aware of these facts before it ever wrote up its caption. But pictures are what counts. No one registered the correction. Everyone remembered the mislabeled image.